Good morning, everyone. Happy second day of spring and welcome to another nonprofit forum. Today, we are welcoming Sheri Chaney Jones to talk about why surveys matter and why they are also not enough. Before we get into introducing Sheri, we will cover a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded, and that just means that you will get to see our panelists on screen today, but our attendees will not be seen on screen. The recording will be available to you after the forum's duration using the email address that you used to register for the forum. If you're interested in live captioning, take a look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen that says Show Live Captions. If you have content-related questions for the speaker today, for Sheri, please go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box. And if you're taking a look in there and you see other questions you like, please feel free to upvote those questions. That will help me know what is important to you during the Q&A section. If you have technical issues during the forum, please put those in the chat box. The chat box is being monitored for those types of issues, and so someone will get back to you there. We also encourage fun conversation in the chat box, so feel free to leave your comments or your support for our speaker today. Keep an eye out at the end of the forum, you'll get a survey that will pop up on your screen. We ask you to take the survey just to tell us how we're doing and to give us more ideas on what you'd like to see for our forums. So with that, let's learn a little bit more about Sheri Chaney Jones. Sheri is the founder of both Measurement Resource Company and SureImpact, Inc. She also was the author of Impact and Excellence, published in 2014. For more than 20 years, Sheri has improved governments and nonprofits and small businesses through performance measurement, evaluation, and organizational behavioral best practices. At The Ohio State University, Sheri taught a course on creating a culture of measurement as a part of the Certified Public Managers Program. And she earned a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology from Central Michigan University and a bachelor's degree with distinction in psychology from The Ohio State University. And with that, I will turn it over to Sheri for our content today.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm so excited to be here with you all today to talk about surveys. Let me quickly get my screen up here. All right, so let's get started. So it is always a pleasure and a treat to have so many people log in on a Tuesday morning to talk about surveys and data and measurement. As you'll see throughout this presentation, I'm extremely passionate about this topic, and I hope my passion is enthusiastic and I share it with you. So as Danielle mentioned, I am the founder of both Measurement Resources Company and SureImpact, which is built on decades-long career helping government and nonprofit organizations better measure, track, and communicate their unique social impact. So prior to founding Measurement Resources Company, I was actually a government funder. I worked for the Department of Aging at the state level, also served as the deputy of performance evaluation with the Franklin County Domestic and Juvenile Courts. And in both of those roles, my job was to look at the impact of the grants that we funded, as well as then talk about, measure, and communicate the impact of the work that we were doing. And through that work, I saw how measurement and data were transforming how these organizations were able to tell their story. They're also transforming their organization's culture and transforming how we served our communities. And I looked around and saw that many nonprofit leaders and government leaders were struggling with these concepts and wanted to bring them to as many individuals as possible. So in 2010, I launched a Measurement Resources Company. I left state government to fully help increase how the sector uses data to solve complex social problems. And then in 2018, I launched SureImpact, which is a cloud-based software solution to help automate how organizations track and measure their communication. And so over the past 13 years or so, I've had the opportunity to work with 300 and more government and nonprofit organizations just like yourself helping them use data to solve these complex social problems. And today I want to share with you some of the concepts and best practices they use, success stories they've had, and give you some tips and tools to help you take that information and put it into your organization as well. A lot of the work that I'll be sharing or research that I'll be sharing can be found in my book, Impact and Excellence, which I never thought I would write a book. It was never anything that I aspired to do necessarily on my list of things I wanted to do in my life. However, when launching or leaving state government, moving towards launching Measurement Resources Company, I did the only thing I knew how to do. And it's actually something we'll be talking about today in terms of how to launch, how to use surveys, how to use data to better tell your story. But what I did is I launched an unfunded market research study. So what I did is I developed what was called the Measurement Culture Survey, and I sent that originally to about 250 local nonprofit and government organizations to look at what data they had, how are they using data, and what results were they getting. And my reason for this initial survey was to help me understand basically market research. Was there a need for my services? Was it a good idea for me to leave state government and form this company to help nonprofits use data more strategically? And the results that I found were so powerful that I knew that I needed to share them with as many nonprofits as possible. So at that time, I thought, well, I had a sample of about 30. That wasn't enough for me to feel confident in the results. So I launched a national unfunded market research study in order to really make sure, confirm, and validate that these results were true. And what I found was that nonprofits, and why I was so inspired and why I wrote the book and what the research I share in the book, is that nonprofit organizations who have data aligned with their mission and they're strategically using it to make decisions and communicate their impact to stakeholders and funders, we're significantly more likely to do the things that your board is wanting you to do, and your executive directors and your leadership team are asking you to do. They were significantly more likely to raise more money. They were significantly more likely to create greater impact. They were significantly more likely to have better relationships with media, funders, peer organizations, policymakers, and they had greater collaboration, communication, and cooperation within their organizations. And so, although these particular results validated my hypothesis, if you will, it fueled my passion to take this information out into the world and to equip and inspire nonprofits to be using this work within their organization. And so let's talk about what does it mean to create these high-performing measurement cultures where data is helping you drive decisions. And so here on this slide, the ideal measurement cycle, it is all of the things the nonprofits should be doing to measure their impact. And when we see the highest performing nonprofits, they have a system, a cycle of measurement woven throughout their day-to-day. And we'll talk about this and how surveys interact with all of these different types of ways. So the very first thing is needs assessment. You should be at least once every 5 years, but if you haven't done one since the pandemic, likely now is a good time for you to do a needs assessment. And a needs assessment is looking at what are the needs of your beneficiaries, what are the needs of your community, what are the needs of your stakeholders, and to make sure that you completely understand where, whatever the mission is you have, that you are meeting the needs and your programs and services are aligned to those needs. And so your logic model, your theory of change should be grounded and rooted in that needs assessment. You should make sure that your activities that you're performing, the services that you're providing are strategically aligned and addressed with the needs of your community, and that your theory of change shows some logical progression of how those activities that you're providing will then transform the community in the ways that your mission is aligned. And so that's where we get into program design. So 1, 2, and 3 here on this slide, your needs assessment, your logic model and theory of change, and your program design should all be informed and grounded together. Then another opportunity where you should be using measurement regularly within your organization is to having a data-driven strategic plan. So again, you're going to use the results from your needs assessment. You're going to use the results from looking at how well you're performing, evaluation data, others, to develop this strategic plan. But your strategic plan should have metrics aligned to it. And so you're using those metrics in order to figure out, are you on track or off track? Then we have this concept of a measurement framework, which is, and we'll talk a lot about the measurement framework today, but it is how your organization is telling your story. It is that the concept of, okay, we have this logic model, we have this theory of change, and this is how we were going to measure basically our outputs and our outcomes, and we'll talk more about that. Then we should be constantly looking at our process evaluation. So are we doing what we said we do, and measuring how we're doing it? And then impact evaluation is, what are the results that we're having? What are the outcomes our people are experiencing because of our work? And then once we've put all of that in place, then we're able to start to move into more higher level evaluation, which is calculating our social return on investment. Again, a very data-driven approach in order to communicate to stakeholders kind of what is the cost benefit analysis to the community. So sometimes we look at community cost savings in a social return on investment, or depending on your mission, we might be looking at benefits to the community in your social return on investment. But let me tell you, this is a journey, and everyone in this call is going to be somewhere along the spectrum of this journey, and you start wherever you are. And so if you're at the place now where you're thinking, wow, we're not even data driven in our program design, then it's likely we need to start at a needs assessment. But maybe you know that you are data driven in your program design, you have a theory of change, you've got a logic model, and you just need to add metrics to how you measure and communicate your work. But if you're already up the chain and you've got process evaluation data and impact evaluation data, then maybe it's time to look at creating a social return on investment calculation. And so in this kind of measurement cycle, if you will, that nonprofits should be engaging in, we recommend that evaluation work is ongoing. It should be the part of how you do your business. Same thing with then updating once you create your first social return on investment calculation. Every year you can update it based on your evaluation data. 3-year cycles for a data-driven strategic plan, and at least a 5-year cycle for needs assessments. If there are giant shifts in the community like we've seen in the last 3 years, you may want to update that in the future. But that's a good kind of a guideline to see where should you be data-driven? How are those high-performing nonprofits, those that we saw in our surveys who are raising more money, were increasing impact, had better cohesion and collaboration within their organizations? This is where they were in the journey. Now, here, the title of our work today is Why Surveys Are Important and Why They're Not Enough. And so this is where surveys intersect. So all of the things on your screen that are highlighted in yellow, those are the particular activities where survey data will play into it. So in your needs assessments, you may be launching surveys of your beneficiaries or your intended audiences. Same thing with research, doing research related to the needs in your community, or the benefits of your programs to your beneficiaries. And then your program design, that needs to be informed by this research, which might be influenced by surveys. Again, strategic planning can be part of that. Evaluation and impact evaluation, all of this information, you can use surveys to collect this data. And we'll talk a lot about what is a good survey, how do we structure surveys to get this information, why they work, and when they're not enough. So this is an hour presentation. There is no way I can cover everything I possibly want to cover in 1 hour's time when talking about helping your organization become data-driven. But we do have a free ebook for you if you want a quick guide that dives deep into everything that we have here. So feel free to use that QR code, or you can go to SureImpact.com to download Expanding Your Social Impact. We'll also be forwarding the slides afterwards, so you'll have access to this, and we'll make sure you know how to get this free ebook, which digs much deeper into what we'll be talking about today. So as a nonprofit, and when we're talking about a high-performing, data-driven nonprofit, you will need you should have at the very least these 3 types of data within your organization. And we'll talk about where surveys play in and where other types of data need to come in and fill in the story. So the first is what was done. This is the fundamental core of what your nonprofit is doing. It's basically your outputs. If you've ever been in logic model land or had a grant that's asked you what are your outputs and what are your outcomes. So outputs is simply a count of who you serve, their demographics, and what was done with them. Okay, so that's a fundamental source. So as we're going through this presentation, you should be thinking about your own organization, because remember, creating an impact-centric organization, creating that high-performing nonprofit organization where it's very data-driven and you're using insights to drive performance, drive funding opportunities. It's a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. So just remember that, you can keep improving. You can keep adding to your sophistication in terms of the data you're collecting and how you're using it. But at the very minimum, let's start here. Let's start with our outputs. Ask yourself, do I know who we're serving, how many unique people we're serving, how many duplicate people we're serving, and what are their demographics, and what services are we providing? So that's what was done. Those are our outputs. Then we'll move on to quality, which is how well it's done. So these are our metrics that help us understand basically the relationship between what we do and the results that we're getting in our community and in the people's lives that we serve. And so how well it was done that's where those needs assessment data comes into, because if we're not meeting the needs of our community, or if we're not delivering our services in a timely way, a culturally responsive way, in a way that resonates with our audiences, which is our beneficiaries, then we are less likely to be able to achieve the outcomes that we want. Measurement Resources Company did a study of an organization or a community, and access to healthcare was an issue in that particular community. And the community was very, they were kind of perplexed, I'll say, because they had invested a lot of money and resources into an infrastructure, into a beautiful health center, which the community members had access to at low cost or for free, depending on their economic situation. Yet they still were not accessing this healthcare center, even though it was right there for them in their community. And when we use surveys to figure out why the community was not engaging in this work, what we learned was that they did not feel like that center was for them. And really it boiled down to the culturally responsiveness, the community engagement that was involved. And so those would be the type of metrics that helped us understand how well it was done. So if you have services in your community to offer these healthcare, and you're not getting the increased health outcomes that you desire, or the access to your care, it's likely a quality issue that might be in the middle. So we want to make sure that we're collecting this data as well. And then who is better off? These are the results that you're having. So think about your mission statement. What is that why? Why does your organization do what it does? Is it increased economic stability, educational outcomes, fun, enjoyment, environmental impacts, economic impacts in the community? So you need to get really clear on what your organization is here to do, and have metrics around those, because those are your outcomes. That is what you're going to measure. And so I can do a whole nother session on just these 3 types of data, but I wanted to start with this to help you understand where you might be using survey data in order to answer these questions related to quality and outcomes. And a lot of times survey data is how you're going to capture the better off, the outcomes data, as well as how well is it done, as well as your needs assessment. So I get this question all the time, so I'm just going to lead with this. Yes, surveys are an acceptable way to measure impact. However, we need to make sure that we're creating Good surveys, we're systematic about it, we're thoughtful about it, we know why we're doing it, we know why we're collecting the data we're collecting, we have a theory behind it. So there's a lot of caveats to that. Is it acceptable? Absolutely, it's acceptable. But the whole point of this webinar is to educate you on how to create a good survey, a robust survey, so that you can use them to measure impact. And why is it acceptable? Well, because most of us are dealing with humans, we're dealing with people. Social scientists have perfected many surveys. And one of the things that I think we all know that is a giant survey, but it's how the government makes funding decisions. It's how a lot of large foundations use this type of information to decide where they want to invest, where the community needs are, is the community census, right? The federal census. And what is that? Well, that is a survey, right? It's something that the government sends to every resident and asks them to complete it about their situation and about themselves. And then that data is aggregated and made available to the community. So when we're thinking about, if you ever run into this and someone asks you, well, we can't use surveys. Yes, you can. We just want to be thoughtful in how we're doing it, how we're collecting the data, how we're being systematic about the information. But surveys are absolutely a appropriate way to measure impact, with all the caveats I'll talk about today. So where can we use surveys? Well, I talked about the importance of a needs assessment and how our program design, our program model should be based on the wants and needs of our constituents. Now, most of you on the call are nonprofit organizations. That is your tax status. But remember, it's just that. It is a tax status. You are still in business to, yes, you are in business to make money, but I'm not going to talk much about the whole business to make money, because a nonprofit is in business for impact. They are in business to solve a community's need or provide a service to the community that we've all decided it's more beneficial to offer a nonprofit tax status, if you will, to the community versus a for-profit tax status. So it doesn't matter. You still need to deliver services in the community that address the needs and wants of those members, because if we do not do so, we will not see the results that we desire. So a needs survey data is super beneficial for making sure that we're systematically collecting the wants and needs of the populations that we're serving, so that we can match our program design to meet those wants and needs. Same thing with perceptions and awareness. Again, most of us have some element of we need to influence people in order to see the social change we desire within our communities. And so that requires us to change the hearts and minds of individuals. And when we think about human behavior, whether it is we need donors and community members to care about our cause, so they give us money, or we're an advocacy organization and we want individuals to change their behavior in terms of how they vote or the policies that they think are important, or that they participate in recycling or environmental behavior or more healthy behavior, whatever it is that your nonprofit is trying to achieve, you have to remember that humans' behavior follows the mindset. And so at the core of everything, whether we want someone to stop smoking, we want someone to participate in a different advocacy behavior, whatever it is that we're trying to see, the change. We are all about change. We are all change makers here on this call. Well, change, if we're talking about people, the first ingredient of change is to change that mindset. So we have to understand where people are today in terms of their perceptions and awareness. And then if we want to measure our success at that, that's typically our first outcome, is change in perception and awareness. The only way to measure that change from beginning to end and to make sure we're hitting that mark is through survey data, asking people. It is the only way that we can measure that. Now, behavior often can be observable in some other ways. But if we just wait until we start to see the behavior change, what we will miss is, did we miss the first step? Are we not seeing the behavior change yet because we didn't get the change perceptions and attitudes? Because if that's true, then we need to go upstream on how we are delivering our program services, messages, and communication. But if we do learn that, you know what, we were successful at changing perceptions and attitudes and awareness, but we still haven't yet to see the behavior change, now that's going to change our interventions, because maybe there's something structural going on, there's some barrier that's keeping one from, they may want to participate in a new behavior or do something new, but there's something else getting in the way that needs to be addressed. But without measuring this, we won't know which way it is. Same thing with quality and performance. Oftentimes we do need to measure the results related to one's perceptions of quality, cultural responsiveness, timeliness. Again, that's all going to come from the perceptions of the beneficiaries of your services. And perception is reality. So surveys is a great way to gather that information. And then also, there are often times where surveys will be used to measure impacts and outcomes, whether it's basically things like there are a lot of surveys and assessments used in the behavioral health world. Like even if you just think about the Youth Outcomes Questionnaire or the DESA, these are things that you may be familiar with and using every single day in your work. But these types of tools are essentially assessments. They're essentially surveys. So it's, again, social sector organizations will be and should be using surveys, but we want to use them in strategic and responsible ways. So here we're going into the nitty gritty, the how to, the what do we do, what do I need to think about? And these are questions that we get all the time from board members and leadership when thinking about deciding how to create a good story. So I'm going to give you the building blocks in order to do it. And these slides will be made available so that you'll have them and you can revisit them and think about your organization and how you're doing this. So before you launch a survey, and too many times, you know, people fail to plan or fail to be strategic. They just put together a survey and throw it out there and think that's going to solve all their problems. But let's kind of back up and really think about what needs to happen in the planning section of developing the survey. So first and foremost, we need to decide, who do we want to hear from? Who do we need to hear from, right? If you are highly focused on immigrant populations, then you need to be very, very specific about those audiences, where they are, how you can engage with them, who you need to speak to, how you get connected to them, right? Versus if it's a youth population, the general population. So needing to think about who is your audience. And when you think about that audience, then you will start to think about your sampling goals. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about sampling here in a minute, but how many people do we need to survey in order to feel confident in our results? And so set a goal up front, decide that number up front. How many survey responses do we need to feel confident about our results? And if you want to generalize your results to a larger population, if you're not surveying everybody, like a census is essentially you're surveying everyone in your sphere. But if you're not surveying everyone, if you're choosing to do some random sampling or something else of a larger population, you want to make sure that you are representative, especially if you want to generalize your results to everyone. So consider, what weights do you need to give to your results for maybe underrepresented populations or minority populations, so their voices aren't drowned out in the larger population data. So you need to be very kind of aware of these things before you launch a survey. And then again, think about, how does that audience want to be reached? Can you find them on social media, or do you need to, we find, because we do in measurement resources, we do tons of survey research for our clients. And, when we're working with an aging population, we often find that paper pencil surveys is still the best ways to reach them. And they like that direct mail and getting the response and putting it in the envelope and sending it back. Whereas if we're trying to engage a younger audience, oftentimes using electronic means, social media, surveys is a lot more effective. So depending on who your audience is, will depend on how you survey them and how you reach them. And then you also have to be realistic about how much do you have to invest, because depending on your budget is going to depend on which strategies you can use. And so there's always a bit of a tension and a dance between what is best practice, what would be, the best way to do this, but then what is realistic within our budget, and then modifying your strategy based on your budget. All right, so we talked a little bit about what needs to plan first. Now let's talk about sample size, because I get this question all the time related to what is the sample size that we should use. And I'll talk more about the kind of magic here. But what we need to think about is, what is the population? That's the first and foremost. When we think about sample size, it's what is the size of the population we are looking to hear from. So if all you want to hear from are the youth that you've served this year, because you're doing maybe an assessment of impact, and you've only served 100 people this year, then your population starts at 100 people. That's the total population that you've served. That means that's the total population that you are going to survey. So if you want to, if that's true, you probably should survey every single person. Now, if we're talking about wanting to know what's going on in Franklin County at large, we're going to use different methodologies. But most importantly is to make sure that when we get our survey data back, we have some demographic data on that survey, so we can make sure that we are representative of our entire population. So again, if you served 100 kids and you want to hear from those 100 kids, then you want to make sure that all the children have the opportunity to take that survey. But you might also want to make sure you have some qualifying data in there to make sure that the results that you get back and you're using for analysis, if only the girls answered the survey and not the boys, that's something you want to take into consideration when you're reporting out that data, that this was heavily influenced by female population, and what does that mean, and whose voices may have been left out. So now I'm going to get very, very technical here for a minute, because oftentimes people ask me like, well, is this a good response rate? I got 22% of the people I served responded. Is that good or bad? And the answer is, it really depends on these factors. It's the margin of error and the confidence intervals, which are going to decide whether we feel confident sharing this data out as representative of a population or not. And so you'll often see in reports when people are talking about survey data that there's a 90% confidence interval with a 5% margin of error. And basically what that means is that you have confidence that, let's say 85% of you got a response. So you surveyed everyone and you asked them, how satisfied were you with our services? And 85% said they were satisfied or very satisfied with your services. So how you would interpret this would be, you would say, okay, we are 90% confident that the real answer, meaning if we got a response from every single person in the world, the real answer is somewhere between 90 and 80%. I know I'm throwing a lot of percents at you, but basically the concept is, the higher the confidence interval is, how you're more confident if that number is true. And so the way we're going to decide whether that number, we feel really confident about that number is true, is how many people are in the population versus our sample size. So I'm going to kind of blow all that up and say this is really important. And luckily we live in an age now where there are sample size calculators on the internet for free. So I do recommend that anytime anyone is interested in doing a survey and wants to set goals to their sampling, just Google sample size calculator and they will show up where you can put in, I mean, back in the day when I was in school, I had to use tables like this, but now you can go in, you can say my population is 100, I want a 95% confidence level with a 5% margin of error, and it will tell you how many people you need to survey. But the golden rule for survey data, if you're doing a needs assessment or if you have a large population, as you can see on this table, whether your population is 10,000, 100,000, 500,000, or 1,000,000, you'll see there's this, for 95% confidence level with a 5% margin of error, you'll see the total sample size is less than 400. So we say that for the rule of 400, it's your magic number. It is if you are looking at Franklin County, if you are looking at, large school system, if you're looking for a neighborhood, right? If you can get 400 responses, then you can feel, and you make sure that they're representative of the entire population, you can feel confident that you can generalize those results out to the rest of the population. And here's why. It's a really easy thing to think about, but think about a pot of chili. So whether you're making soup for your family, pot of chili for your family, or your whole entire block, you're having a block party and you're bringing a pot for the entire block, you use the same spoon, the same size spoon, to test if that chili is got the right spiciness, right? So that's the same thing with sampling. So 400 is kind of the size spoon we need, whether we have 1,000,000 people in our population or 100,000 people in our population. We want to get to about 400. Now, if you're less than 10,000, we need less responses, but sampling size calculations will really help you figure that out. But that's kind of the rule of thumb. So it's not about response rate. It's about how big is your population and how many responses have you gotten back. And if let's say you do have 1,000 people that you wanted to survey, but you only got 100 back, you can still use those 100 responses. It's just you need to be responsible to talk about what is the confidence level and the margin of error of those data. And so if the margin error is now 10 instead of 5, then you should say in your survey results, well, if the answer is 85%, we will expect to see it between 95 and 75% type of thing. So that's a lot of math for you. I will move on to new topics. So I talked about demographics and why we want to make sure that we do have some basic demographics in our survey results. Now, we don't want everything. So demographics is a very interesting thing to ask, because if we ask demographics in our surveys, we can offend people, and we can have people kind of want to not take our survey. But it is important that we collect some demographics so we can speak to the representative nature of our results, and that we can then slice and dice the data by different demographic groups, which helps us make sure there are no differences between key demographics that matter to us. So the very first thing is we want to make sure that if we're going to collect data about one's demographic, that we are going to use it and that it matters to our mission. So for example, if household income does not matter to our mission at all, then don't ask the information. It's not needed. If you don't know why household income matters to your theory of change, why it matters to the targeted populations you serve, why it matters to how you're going to analyze the data, then don't ask it. Same thing with employment status or education or zip code, race, gender. If you don't know how you're going to use that data, and you don't know, basically why you, as part of your theory of change, then don't ask it, because the more demographic questions you ask on a survey, the less likely you will get responses. People will abandon it. And then also, this is really important, put that information at the end of your survey. This is a mistake that so many people make a mistake of doing, is they send out a survey, they ask all of the boring demographic questions first. It scares people away. Sometimes it can cause, when someone asks those types of questions, either they'll abandon the survey, they'll feel less trusting because you've asked this type of information. And so you want to make sure that you ask the most interesting and important questions first of your participants, and then ask the demographic questions at the end. There might be some times where, when we're creating a survey, if it's very, very important, if like gender and age or racial makeup is very, very important for our sampling strategy, we might ask those 3 basic questions early on in the survey to make sure that we don't get a lot of abandons when we get to that section. But we take everything else, all the other demographic data, and put it at the end. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is basically how are we going to ask our questions in our survey. So we have our question and answer options. We want to make sure that we're using the most structured format as possible. And so when we want to avoid open-ended and closed-ended questions, or open-ended questions, as limited as possible, because it's harder to analyze, it's harder to make systematic sense of. So we're going to want to stick with a multiple choice or nominal scale, a Likert scale, a rating scale. I don't love rank order, but even that, but you want to do something as strategic as possible in order to use our data. So if you have an open-ended question, ask yourself, how can I turn this question into a Likert scale, a rating scale, or some other scale, so I have systematic ways to analyze that information. So let's talk about this nominal multiple choice. So a nominal scale, multiple choice scale, is essentially one where you're giving people options. There's not necessarily, in the way we analyze the data, we can't treat it as a continuous variable. We can't, treat it as it's like an intensity of rating, but we are going to force people into deciding that they have one of those choices. So the pros are that you can control the responses. It's very easy to analyze. People prefer to answer it. These questions are easier to take. Now, they do force people into options that might not apply, and we might miss nuances. So those are the cons of this, but by far, the nominal multiple choice outweighs open-ended responses. So here's an example of a nominal or multiple choice question. Which of the following describes your body weight? Again, why this would be less intrusive is if we ask someone, can you please give us your height and your weight? Well, that feels very personal. We could then use that to decide where these categories are, but instead we're kind of just letting people select on the spectrum where they are. Close-ended, yes and no, these are a great answer, especially if you just want to understand where someone is. They're really only good if it is a binary question. And if there is any way to be in between or maybe or gray area, do not use yes and no, especially if you're looking at satisfaction or likelihood, because there's so much nuance there that you're going to miss it. And then people often are going to be more positive and say yes, even maybe when they're less favorable. So unless the answer can only be yes or no, I often recommend that we avoid close-ended yes/no questions. But here's an example of one we've used. Are you a foster care parent and have foster care youth in your household? Either you do or you don't, or you choose not to answer. All right, my favorite questions are the Likert scale questions. These, and don't make up your Likert scale. Please go and find a validated Likert scale. But these are your rating matrix where you see 1 to 5 or 5 to 7 scales. And these are really great because not only does it let the audience know the degree of their insight or the degree of their feeling towards something, but they're great for analysis. And the reason you might be asking, why do people use these Likert scales? It's because of the way you can analyze the data. You're able to, if you use a validated one, you're able to use the data as a continuous variable, which gives you more power and analysis. And so anyway, it's a really great type of metric to use to compare groups, to understand the degree of intensity of a feeling. Social scientists have proven how the strength of one's attitude on Likert scale predicts behavior. So the stronger you are on a Likert scale, the more likely you'll behave in positive ways. And so I highly, highly, highly recommend using Likert scales. And again, you can miss important nuances because you're forcing someone into five choices versus letting them expound on their results, but absolutely choose a Likert scale when at all possible. Now we have rank order. Here's an example of a rank order scale we did for the Naples players, we did ask them to say which one was most important and least important when deciding something. And you can do that. And I choose to stay away from these, but there are times when we will ask people to say most important to them. The reason why is we're missing the degree in which that's important, because let's use this example. Let's say the day of the week was very important. It was my most important, but also because I can't go to class on Tuesdays or Thursdays. So if it's a Tuesday or Thursday, I'm not going to go. But the title or topic is equally as important. So to me, you would miss that, right? You would miss that I'm also going to make my decision on the title or topic. I'm not just going to sign up for a class if it's on Tuesday or Wednesday that I can attend. So you do miss a lot of information, and they're pretty difficult to analyze. So I avoid rank order as much as I possibly can. Now, open-ended surveys, keep them to a minimum, no more than 3 on any given survey. They are great because they give us a lot of extra nuance to interpret our results. However, they are very difficult to analyze, especially when you get into large amounts of survey responses. It's really hard to compare groups or samples based on open-ended questions, because you don't know if you don't have the data because someone didn't answer it, or because they didn't have an opinion, like the missing data, and you get a lot of it, you don't know why it's missing. But here's an example of a good open-ended question. What kind of support for youth to reach their goals would you like to see from your community, residents of Barberton, private business, or public service organizations of Barberton? So you're being very, very specific in terms of what you want them to ask. So the more specific open-ended questions, the better it is that you have to answer that data. And I know we're getting here towards the Q&A, so I'm going to try to wrap it up. But I also want to let you know how important it is that when you are thinking about survey design, you're thinking about community engagement, making sure that you are leaning into your community champions, you are finding the right partners to help you distribute those surveys, making them available in different languages and translations, making sure that if you do an online survey, are there any barriers to having access to the internet, youth, making sure you get parental consent, community engagement and influencing community engagement into survey development is something that Measurement Resources values very much in all of our projects. And so we value it so much that we created a best practice community engagement guide when using surveys and getting the voices of the community. And that can be found on measurementresourcesco.com's website. You can download that guide for free as well to understand how to better engage the community through surveys and survey research. So that's a lot about why surveys matter and why it is so important for the community to use that. Basically, surveys help us understand the root causes, why something is happening, and it helps us fix it. So those are one of the reasons we should be using surveys. Also, correlations. Again, I talked about if we have those Likert scales, we can measure the relationship between 2 items to see if they're related, which really helps us understand how to move things forward. But we do need to have some caution, because I think you guys all know this, the correlation does not equal causation. So for example, the classic example is violent crimes and ice cream sales are related, and obviously it's not violent crimes that cause ice cream sales or ice cream sales that cause violent crimes. It's typically just the warmer weather. When people are out, they buy more ice cream, and they also crimes rise in the summer. So we just need to make sure that if we are running correlations between 2 survey questions or items, that we're interpreting that data correctly and understand that there's a relationship there. There may be another factor that's causing that, and just use that information responsibly. Now, regression analysis is even higher level, and I don't expect anyone to go and run a regression analysis themselves after this webinar, but just letting you know that it's a very powerful thing we can do when we use Likert type data with our survey, and it helps us understand which variables have an impact or do not have an impact. So it helps us factor down what is the most important. And so here's an example of results that we did using a regression analysis. It will tell you which factors like, so for this particular example, we were looking at employee engagement. And so we knew that, performance. So we looked at 61% of engagement was explaining performance in that organization. 1.6% was explained by tenure, and only 0.4% was explained by gender and race and ethnicity. So how we use this, and then we knew 40% was something that we didn't identify in the survey. But anyway, how we would use this is know that if we, because 61% was explained by engagement, if we could increase engagement within this organization, we would likely see increases in performance. And here's another, you guys will love this study. This was a great study we did with Center of Hope, and we're able to use regression for a very positive way. We were able to look at survey data and found and mirrored it with some census data. But anyway, we found that $13 million increase in nonprofit organization funding in 2018. The percentage of Black students scoring below proficient in math decreases by 4.5%. And every $3.5 million increase in Black female-led students increased, sorry, my thing is in the way, nonprofit organization funding in 2006, Black students scoring below proficient in math improved or decreased by 10%. So this is how we can use regression analysis to see the relationships and what predicted this. So in this case, the more funding that was going to Black female-led nonprofits, we knew that it would predict the proficiency in student scores because of the cultural responsive nature of those particular nonprofits. So why, just briefly, why they're not enough, and then we will turn it over to Q&A. So the one thing that we talked about is a lot of using surveys, but surveys are just a one-time thing, right? They can be a one-time thing. So we need to make sure that this data collection is a continuous part of our culture, and that we want to be communicating and learning from it. And it's important across your whole entire organization, not just one thing the grant writer does or an evaluator does, and it lives in their shop. We need to make sure that it is all going all the time. And so the manual approach to impact measurement is this, and it's costly and it's time consuming, but this is the reality that most nonprofits live in. To get to the outcomes that we talked about, increased funding, increased effectiveness, this is the process that needs to go through. You need to have that measurement framework. You need to be strategic about always, how are you collecting data? How are you using it? Most nonprofits have that information in multiple systems. Then you've got to merge all that data to make sense and analyze it, have conversations about what it means, make those improvements, share the successes with your funders, then repeat the cycle and continue to do it in order to get the outcomes like increased funding and increased impact. And so when measurement resources came out, or not measurement resources, impact and excellence came out, this was the cycle I was teaching, I was training. And what I discovered is that where nonprofits were getting held up was in 2 and 3. So maybe they were doing a survey at one point in time, but they didn't have a great way to consistently collect and use that data to make decisions. And so now the good news is we live in a technology leverage world. And so we need to leverage our technology so that we're constantly having these data and our insights at our ability. So when you implement technology, such as a platform like SureImpact, it gives you that ability to analyze the data continuously, have real-time view of your impacts, be able to make data as part of your culture, and drive those and look at the comparisons, right? You're able to see trends over time, compare yourself to similar organizations, your community. So when we have continuous feeds of data, we're able to drive even better performance. But you know, a lot of that comes with the basis of surveys, but it's understanding it's not one and done, that we need to have other data systems that we're using to incorporate that survey data to make sense of it, to measure trends over time. So I've thrown so much at you today. I appreciate it, but I want to give us enough time to answer everybody's questions.
Oh, Sheri, when you brought up that variance and I can't even remember what the name of it, but you took me through the way back educational machine there where it's like, oh my gosh, there was a stats class that mentioned that at some point. So I have an initial question for you that is just for my own sake, and then I have two here in the Q&A box. So for the audience, now's the time. Please go ahead and plop those questions into the Q&A box for Sheri, and I will go through those now. But you mentioned a lot of terminology here, and I think our audience is varied in our ability levels and things we've been exposed to. And I'm wondering if there is a resource that one can access to bring them up to speed in that area. I'm thinking a glossary of terms or a tried and true way that you take folks through this so that they can all be on the same page.
It's a really good question. And I'm going to ask Sarah Parker, who's our director of communications, if we have any guides on our website, blogs. I know that measurement cycle, I know we wrote a whole blog about it. So I do think we do have a site that explains more. What is a needs assessment? What is an evaluation, impact evaluation? I do believe we've written more on that. So if she's listening, hopefully she'll put that in the chat where you can access that. But that's a great question. And maybe if we don't have that, Danielle, we'll throw that together and send it your way.
Wonderful, thank you. So the first question that we have in our Q&A box today is, it says, these days, should we plan for multiple formats to reach audiences regardless of the target audience to maximize reaching people in whatever their preferred method?
Yes, I would say absolutely yes. And that's where we talk about in our community engagement guide is kind of understanding who are those audiences and which ways to meet them. So if it is like you're going into a senior center, probably showing up with paper and pencil forms is of the same survey is best. And then if you're partnering with schools, sending an email link out to the schools for parents to complete online. And there's nothing wrong, like there's been a lot of research to look at, are you getting different responses from paper, pencil, and online surveys? And the answer is, as long as the questions are the same, the question answers are the same, it's fine to use multiple methods of survey collection to collect that data. But really it's about understanding your audience and how they best can be reached and give you the feedback.
Sheri, can I ask you to stop sharing your slides so we can see the interpreter a little bit bigger for the Q&A section?
Yes. Oh no, where'd you go? There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have another question here in the Q&A box that says, using data, what type of presentation method do you recommend to audiences? So they're giving examples of infographics, testimonials. I'm thinking of charts and graphs and dashboards versus, text heavy, et cetera.
Yep, absolutely. So I like to say it's a yes and. The best way to present impact data, well, very first is, again, back to your audience. Who is your audience? And understanding what it is, first and foremost, what they want to know about your mission. So if you're talking to a government funder who cares about how you're saving the community money and community costs, you're going to tailor your message to how your organization does that. If you're talking to a parent and you want to explain how your programming increases their students' life skills or educational outcomes, you're going to want to lean more heavily into that story. So make sure that you understand who your audience is when sharing information. But I think the best and most powerful way to share stories in information and data is using the mix, data and story together. So people in the nonprofit world, we make decisions on emotions, but we'll rationalize those decisions with our brain. And so if we can couple a story, meaning, how someone engages in our program or a success story they've had with the data, showing that, 87% of students also had that experience. Now what we're doing is presenting the data and using a simple chart or infographic to do that, coupled with a short testimonial or a story, we've now kind of met both sides of how we make decisions, our heart and our head.
That is wonderful. I actually have a question about the concept of a culture of measurement, which I think is where a lot of our nonprofits might be starting, even if they have bits and pieces of a measurement strategy in place. They may or may not have a culture of measurement, either because they don't have a fully trained staff on how to use them, or they don't have the right tools or techniques on how to use them, or they don't necessarily have full buy-in. Can you talk about how to establish that culture of measurement within an organization?
Yeah, so what we found is that the number one factor that predicts if an organization is going to adopt measurement and use measurement and achieve those successes and not has nothing to do with the size of the organization, the budget of the organization. The number one factor is the commitment and willingness of leadership. And I think that's like most anything, that if you are committed to using data and measurement, then you will either, if you don't have the capacity within your organization, you will seek it out. You will find the resources that will help you do that. And I think we live in a really great age where there are a lot of technology solutions now that can help streamline this for nonprofits, that can take out the hard for nonprofits, that makes data, especially with data analysis. The days of needing a data scientist on staff to be able to be a data-driven culture is not, it's not necessary anymore. But what is necessary is building that data literacy. And so some of my presentations, I talk about how data literacy is a skill set that everyone, especially nonprofit leaders, need to have. And so if you find that your staff don't have data literacy, that's probably a professional development opportunity. And attending a webinar like this is a good first start, but to helping organizations feel, your staff to feel a little bit more comfortable with how to interpret data, how to read data, how to use data. They don't need to learn. I know I threw out regression and correlations, statistical terms, just because I think it's important to be aware of them. You don't have to know how to do them because technology can do that stuff for us today, but you do need to understand what they are, why it's important, and how to use them.
So when I think about nonprofits, because again, we have a very large, range of nonprofits that we serve that attend these webinars, they have different sizes of staff. And so I know the impetus will be, just make it a priority and it will happen. And we see that, that so much falls on the make it a priority because there are so many high priorities, especially with the critical work our organizations are doing. Is there a very first step that our organizations can take that can help support them?
Yeah, so the very first step that we say actually has nothing to do with measuring data. It is to make sure that your organization has a very solid theory of change logic model in place. And so basically what that is, I didn't talk much about that on this presentation, is a one sheet of paper where you clearly identify these are our inputs. These are the things that are unique about our organization. Here are our activities. This is what we do to those individuals. And this is this is the short-term outcomes. What do we expect to see immediately after intervention? And these are our medium-term outcomes. What do we expect to see, after some time engaging with our organization? If that is the first thing an organization does, why that's so important is it then allows them to go, okay, this is the universe of things that we could measure. By no means do you want to measure everything on that piece of paper, but it gives you a starting point to know if we want to communicate, what did we do, how well did we do it, and how people are better off. We now can start to say, this is how we'll measure outputs. And these are the key outcomes that are important to us. And here's how we're going to measure them, or take that to an expert like Measurement Resources or someone and say, these are our outcomes. How would you recommend that we measure them? But that really, once you have that framework, it makes measurement so much easier.
So you mentioned SureImpact, and I am wondering if you, for our organizations at the smaller range, if you have any recommendation around data analysis tools that are readily available, either accessible online or ways that they can do them, pen to paper, so that the survey doesn't get put on the shelf after it's taken.
Yeah, absolutely. And so before SureImpact was even a thing, I used to recommend to, and I still do, to early stage nonprofits, is that use the tools that you have available to you. And so, for example, SurveyMonkey, you may want to pay for a version just so you can get more survey responses. But even something like a SurveyMonkey that's $15 a month or something that's quite affordable, in my opinion, it will analyze the survey data for you. It will give you some trends over time. And so leverage those tools that you have available to you just to get started, right? Because as we've watched nonprofits grow, is that when those who start with data at their core, they're able to then tell a better story in that grant application. They're talking about, hey, here are the needs we learned from our community. Here's the outcomes of our work. Then they obviously are attracting more funding, and then that's how they're scaling and growing to then create an organization which they are ready for more of a robust case management data analytics system.
And what do you think is the utility of Excel, which is a program many people have access to already? Do you think that's something that folks can use for this?
Yeah, I do. I think they can. I think that there's a lot of challenges with Excel, like for a long-term solution. But if it's, what I say is you got to get started somewhere. And if getting started is using Excel to make sense of your data, to analyze your data, if you have people on your team who are comfortable using Excel, it's perfectly acceptable place to start. I would caution organizations, though, to not stay with Excel long term, because then it becomes very complicated. It can get corrupted. We've watched clients lose years of data with complicated worksheets, and so there are some downsides to Excel. But if you're getting started, start with the tools you have. Don't say, oh, I can't measure yet because I don't have the resources to buy some expensive SaaS system or something like that. Start with what you have.
Yes, Excel is not a data management solution.
Yes.
It is a giant, elaborate calculator.
Yes, I agree.
But in a pinch, it can do the job. But transitioning a little bit, because we have just a little bit more time, to an affordable, straightforward data management tool for a nonprofit organization. So say that you're just starting out, or all you've known of is Excel at this point. What are some data management tools? And they don't have to be proprietary or solutions that you might have, strategies.
Yeah. What are some data management tools? Well, so I think that's where you might be catching me in a bit of a hard spot, Danielle, because when when Measurement Resources was helping nonprofits kind of understand how do they track, what did they do, how well they do it, and how people are better off, right? Those are the three things any nonprofit should have, and if you can use Excel to answer those three questions, or you can use Google Sheets or Google Docs to do that, and it's working for your organization, then stay there. But I think as soon as you get to a place where you can't answer those three basic questions, what did you do, how well did you do it, and how people are better off, that's when it's time to look into a data management system, a data management tool for your organization. And when you're evaluating what's out there, and so I know a lot of nonprofits do try to or use like a Salesforce solution because they have it for other reasons. And that's something you may be able to use, but you just want to make sure that your tool doesn't dictate what you measure. What you want to measure dictates your tool. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense.
Yeah.
And folks on the line, I would encourage you to look within your professional networks and organizations to answer this question as well, because there are tools that exist that are specific to the work you do. For example, case management tools, pantry tools. So digging in to find those resources as well.
Yeah, but I think that the key is to know, that's where that logic model is so important to know, and your measurement framework is so important. Know what questions and insights you want to know before you go even talk to any vendor, because a vendor will sell you or build you whatever it is, or I'm sorry, whatever you tell them to, or they'll tell you what you measure. But if you know exactly what you want to measure, then they'll be able to say, yes, you can use our system to do that, or no, you can't. And so I think that's really key for any nonprofit to own what they want to measure and the insights they want to get out of any system.
That's really, so you said it. The very first step is the logic model. Don't go past that to do anything else. There are several steps before you have to start looking at a data management system, which include building out how you ask your questions, testing the questions, figuring out the best way. There's so many steps between before you get to a data management tool. But I want to ask this question because I see this a lot in the sector as well. How many surveys is too many surveys for any given audience?
Yes, well, I think that's where having a measurement framework up front is so critical, because you know strategically when you're going to survey your audience, right? So, and when I say audience, I don't necessarily mean like audience of people in a theater, but I might mean that the beneficiaries, your target population. And so if you have a coordinated measurement framework, then you'll know, okay, annually we want to survey everyone who engaged with us, and these are like all the different questions we want to ask, because it ties to our strategic plan, it ties to our outcomes data. Or another option might be, we want to survey people 6 months after they've engaged. So you have ways to track, okay, every 6 months, or every month, anyone who was served 6 months ago surveys people. So I think the worst thing that nonprofits can do is always be not being strategic at the beginning and just saying, oh, well, let's do a survey. It's when you have that measurement framework, you can be thoughtful and strategic so you don't over survey your population.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I also think about when you say audience, I think about the number of nonprofit stakeholders that exist in our work. So any one nonprofit will have beneficiaries, and will have funders, and will have board members. And so if you feel the need to blanket each with the same survey multiple times, that may not be the way to go, but figuring out exactly what you need to be asking for each of those audiences could be really important.
Yeah, and especially with, I don't know how many like association or membership organizations are on the call, but I see sometimes organizations with committees fall into the trap of over surveying, because for example, like maybe the policy committee wants to do a survey related to advocacy or policy, and the programming committee then wants to follow it up with a programming survey, and they're surveying the same people. So that's where it's really important, where all leadership are on the same page about this is what we need to know for policy, this is what we need to know for programming, this is what we need to know for membership, and then put all of that information into one request, one survey.
That makes a lot of sense. So you talked a bit about validated Likert scales. And so I wanted to go back into that, because I think we all use Likert scales because they are intuitive, they make sense, and we may not even be using them as Likert scales. We may be using them as ranking without knowing it. And so I wanted to talk a bit about this validation component that you talked about, and where we can find these validated scales.
Sure. So we did publish some of them in Impact and Excellence, but that is not the only place you can find it. If you do like basically a Google search of common Likert scales or tested Likert scales, university websites will pop up with PDFs of Likert scales that are there, kind of researchers have vetted and said these are appropriate ways to ask, whether it's, and I know I'm an industrial and organizational psychologist by training, so I actually went to school to study best practice measurement techniques. So I love this stuff, but most of the normal people wouldn't even know how much research goes into that. Strongly disagree to neutral to agree to strongly agree, right? Those types of scales. And so find that PDF that will pop up and use one of those scales. Don't make up your own, because the reason why, and if you do make up your own, it's fine, but then it's no longer a Likert scale. It's what we would call one of those nominal scales. And you just have to be careful how you use the data, because it can't be treated as a continuous variable in research. Sorry, that's geeky.
That was exactly my follow-up questions. Thank you for answering that without me needing to ask it.
Yeah.
So for you, Sheri, please do not look at the survey that will be popping up on the screen, but for everyone else on the call, you will have a survey pop up on the screen that asks how we are doing here and what types of forums you want to see in the future. Take a moment to fill that out. Sheri, this was a very rich and information-full forum. I am sure folks will continue to return to it over time. Thank you so much for sharing your information with us today. Folks in the audience, please be expecting these slides for this, in addition to any resources that Sheri will be willing to share with us, and a copy of this video recording in your email within about a week of this forum. And with that, thank you so much. Happy second day of spring and have a good rest of your week.
Thank you, Danielle. Thanks, everyone.